Eleanor Harmon had walked into 100 rooms knowing exactly what she would say. She had faced boardrooms of men twice her age, rivals who wanted her to fail, and investors who doubted her name, and she had never once lost her footing. But when she placed the notepad on Caleb Monroe's desk that Tuesday morning and repeated the words her father had spoken the night before, something in the room changed. She watched his face for a flinch, a smirk, any sign of advantage. Instead, Caleb set his pen down slowly, looked up at her, and answered with 4 words that left Eleanor Harmon, for the very first time in her life, with nothing left to say. What did he say, and why, for the first time in her life, did Eleanor Harmon have no answer? Harmon Group had stood at the center of Chicago's commercial landscape for 30 years. Joseph Harmon built it on a philosophy simple enough to write on a napkin: identify what a city needs, build it before the city knows it needs it, and never cut corners on the foundation. That philosophy had produced 32 luxury hotel properties, 4 mixed-use developments that reshaped entire neighborhoods, and a balance sheet that had never once dipped into the red. Now, on the edge of its most ambitious expansion, a $1.2 billion push into Southeast Asian markets, the company was preparing to test whether that philosophy could survive the crossing. Caleb Monroe arrived at the office at 7 o'clock every morning. Not because anyone required it, not because he was making a point, but because the first hour of the day, before the phones started ringing and the conference rooms filled up, was when the numbers told the truth. He was 41 with the kind of lean stillness that came from years of absorbing pressure showing up. His title was Senior Operations Director, and that title covered more ground than it suggested. He reviewed logistical reports from 4 ongoing construction projects, flagged a discrepancy in a subcontractor invoicing chain that would have cost the company $300,000 by the end of the quarter if left unchecked, and forwarded a corrected framework to the procurement team. All before his first cup of coffee went cold. Ryan Callahan, who had worked beside him for 6 years and still occasionally marveled at the man's output, appeared in his doorway that morning and said what he often said: "You do the work of 3 people and complain about the load of 0. Caleb looked up from the spreadsheet, considered that for a moment, and said, "I'm not complaining." Ryan laughed. It was not entirely a joke. The thing that people who worked with Caleb either respected or quietly resented was that he never used what he knew as currency. He was a single father, the details of that were his own, kept clean from the office in the way a man keeps a wound covered not out of shame but out of practicality. His personal life did not enter his professional one. He had drawn that line and he held it without drama, and the steadiness of it was something that Joseph Harmon had noticed early and had never stopped thinking about. Joseph Harmon was the kind of man who saw things. He had built a company on that capacity, the ability to look at a situation, strip away what everyone was saying about it, and see what it actually was. He had spent enough years watching people move through power to recognize which ones were changed by it and which ones simply carried it. Caleb Monroe, in Joseph's estimation, was one of the second kind. There was a rumor circulating in the upper floors that week, the kind that moved through glass-walled offices in murmurs between meetings. Diana Ashworth, a long-standing board member with investments that never quite appeared in the right disclosure columns, was quietly maneuvering to redirect the Southeast Asia expansion toward a new development partner, one that existed outside the company's established vetting process and whose connection to Diana herself had not been disclosed. Caleb had heard the rumor, had reviewed the early proposal documents, had written down what he saw and said nothing yet, because what he had was not yet a fact. It was the outline of a fact, and he had learned the difference. Then came the announcement. An internal memo distributed on a Thursday afternoon. Eleanor Harmon would assume the role of Chief Executive Officer effective the following Monday. Joseph was stepping back from daily operations. Ryan appeared in Caleb's doorway again that same afternoon and said, "She went to Wharton. I heard she once made a department head cry in a budget review." Caleb saved the document he was working on and went back to the project file. The subcontractor issue still needed a final verification, and the expansion timeline still needed another pass. Those things did not change because of a memo. Eleanor Harmon arrived on Monday morning the way she arrived everywhere, without announcement, without theatrics, and without interest in whether the room was ready for her. She was 36 years old, the kind of woman who had decided early that she would not wait to be invited into power. The Wharton degree was real, and so was the decade of consulting work she had done before returning to her father's company, and so was the particular quality of her intelligence, the kind that processed information fast and had no patience for the lag between seeing a problem and solving it. She was in the conference room by 8:45, with a stack of project folders and a legal pad already covered in notes, requesting a full briefing on the Southeast Asia expansion from every department head present. The first time she spoke directly to Caleb Monroe, she asked about a clause in a subcontractor agreement that most people in the room would not have known to look at. He answered without preamble, confirmed the clause, and then, without raising his voice or adjusting his posture, pointed out that the assumption in her follow-up question was off by roughly 11% when applied to the actual site conditions. The room held its breath. Eleanor looked at him. He looked back. He was not being difficult. He was simply correct, and he seemed wholly unbothered by whether that was convenient. She moved on. After the meeting, she said to Jessica, her assistant, "He has a problem with authority." Jessica wrote something on her notepad and did not answer. What Jessica thought and did not say was that the man had seemed entirely respectful, just not of assumptions that happened to be wrong. Caleb said to Ryan later, "She's smart. She just doesn't know yet what she doesn't know." Ryan asked what that was supposed to mean. Caleb said it meant exactly what it sounded like. The second friction point came 4 days later. Eleanor implemented a revised approval process for vendor contracts, a change designed to reduce liability exposure, which was a legitimate goal, but which added 12 to 15 business days to an already tight procurement schedule. Caleb drafted a detailed analysis, 3 pages, cited to actual timeline data written in language clear enough that anyone who read it would understand what the delay would cost. He sent it to her at 4:17 in the afternoon. She replied at 62 with 2 words, "Keep it." He read the reply, forwarded it to his own archive, and marked the date. That same evening, Joseph Harmon called his daughter. He asked Eleanor how the first week was going. She said it was going well, the team was capable, the data was thorough. Then he asked, "What do you think of Caleb Monroe?" Eleanor paused. "Technically excellent," she said, "hard to manage." There was a long silence. Then Joseph said, "You're looking at the wrong thing, Eleanor." She told him she had another call, and after she hung up, she stood at the window of her new office and did not quite understand why the conversation left her irritated in a way that had nothing to do with the expansion. The irregularity appeared on a Thursday, buried in a stack of documents formatted to look routine. Caleb had been cross-referencing land appraisal records for 3 of the proposed Southeast Asia sites when he found it. A pricing adjustment submitted through a third-party intermediary firm that had inflated assessed values by 23% above independent market estimates. The adjustment bore the authorization of a consultant firm that, when Caleb traced it through the registration filings, shared a corporate address with one of Diana Ashworth's private investment vehicles. If the expansion proceeded on those valuations, Harmon Group would not see the discrepancy for 18 months. By the time they did, the sunk costs would make reversal almost impossible. He brought the file to Eleanor's office the following morning. She reviewed it quickly, carefully, and asked 2 clarifying questions that confirmed he had not missed anything. Then she set the folder down and said, "This isn't enough to bring to the board yet. A single intermediary overlap isn't conclusive evidence. You could be looking at a coincidence." He recognized what was actually happening. She was not yet sure enough of her own position to move against a board member in her first month. That was not cowardice. It was strategy. He understood strategy. He said, "Understood." He took the folder and left without arguing. What he did instead was begin pulling additional records, quietly, through channels that did not require anyone's approval, cross-referencing against previous fiscal years. He did not tell anyone. He simply worked. The lunch with Joseph Harmon happened on a Wednesday, at a restaurant Caleb associated with serious conversations. Joseph spoke first. He said he was concerned about Eleanor. Not about her competence, but about her isolation. She was brilliant, he said, and she was alone in the way some brilliant people allow themselves to be alone when they decide that being alone is safer than being seen. The people around her either feared her or wanted something from her, and she could not tell the difference anymore. Then Joseph looked at Caleb and said the thing Caleb had not expected. "You're the only person in that building who doesn't fall into either category, and you've kept your own door closed for long enough that I'm starting to worry about you too." He paused. "A man like you doesn't stop needing someone to come home to just because he's decided not to look." Caleb set down his glass. He said, "I appreciate that, Mr. Harmon, but that's not something either of us can decide for me." Joseph nodded. He said he knew. He said he was saying it anyway. That same week, Joseph made a remark to Eleanor during one of their evening calls, delivered the way he delivered most important things, as an observation he left to her to do something with. He said Caleb Monroe was the kind of man who had been carrying more than his job description for years, and that in his experience, people who carried things that long needed someone who could actually see them. Not what they could do, who they were. He said, simply, I think he needs someone in his corner. And I think you already know you'd like someone in yours. Eleanor said goodnight and ended the call. She sat in her office for 20 minutes without opening her laptop. Then she picked up her pen and wrote a name on the legal pad. Then she crossed it out. Then she went home. She came to his office the next morning before the rest of the floor was fully awake. The lights in the hallway were still on their early setting, cooler, dimmer, and the cleaning crew had just finished. Caleb was at his desk with engineering schematics spread across the surface, marking corrections in pencil. He did not look up when the door opened. He did not look up when he heard her close it behind her. He looked up when she set the notepad on his desk, because the gesture was deliberate in a way that required acknowledgement. Eleanor stood on the other side of the desk, hands loose at her sides, and said it without ceremony. My father said you needed a wife. She said it the way she said everything, directly, without performance. But there was something underneath the directness, something she was checking for. Whether he would use it as an opening, a flirtation, a power move. Whether he would say something that confirmed he had been angling toward this all along. Whether Joseph Harmon, whom she trusted above almost everyone, had been manipulated by someone she had misjudged. Caleb looked at her for a moment. His pencil was still in his hand. He set it down carefully, without urgency, without theater, and then he said the same thing to me, about you. The silence that followed was not comfortable and was not awkward. It was the silence of something landing before the mind has caught up with it. Eleanor had prepared for several possible responses. A deflection, a smile that acknowledged the absurdity of the situation. Even a direct challenge she could answer cleanly. She had not prepared for this, for the information that her father had been working both sides of the same conversation, or for the fact that Caleb said it with no trace of advantage. There was no flicker of satisfaction in his expression, no hint that he understood. He had just handed her something difficult to answer. He said it the way he reported data, with the expectation that it would be useful to have. She regrouped. You know this isn't something that can happen. I know, he said. He did not seem troubled by that. Then why are you? She stopped herself. I'm not doing anything, he said, calm. I'm here to do good work. That's the whole of it, Eleanor. She said, then why did my father? Because he worries about you, Caleb said, and he sees things you've decided you're not going to look at. He said it without edge, without the warmth that would have made it easier to dismiss. She was quiet for a moment. Then, he told me you were someone worth knowing. The sentence was halfway between a question and an admission, and she had not intended it to come out that way. He's a good judge, Caleb said, of most things. Eleanor looked at him, really looked at him, in the way she rarely allowed herself to look at anyone who worked alongside her. What she saw was a man who was not trying to be anything, who was not reaching for her, not retreating, not managing her impression of him. He simply sat in his own skin with a completeness that she recognized, suddenly, as something she had not encountered in a long time. She picked up the notepad. She walked out. In the hallway, she pressed the elevator button and stood with her back straight and her hands steady, because those were the things she had taught herself to control when everything else moved. The elevator arrived. She stepped in. In the mirrored surface of the closing doors, she saw her own face, and for just a moment, she looked like someone who had been asked a question they did not know the answer to. Ryan appeared in Caleb's doorway 2 minutes later, coffee in hand, and asked what that had been about. Nothing that changes anything, Caleb said. Ryan did not believe him, but Caleb had already returned to the blueprint, pencil in hand, and Ryan knew better than to push. Diana Ashworth moved faster than Caleb had expected. A formal proposal landed in the board's shared drive on a Monday, 78 pages, precisely formatted, recommending an accelerated partnership with a development group called Meridian Pacific Holdings. The proposal bypassed internal technical review entirely, citing the company's interest in moving before competitor capital secured the same sites. It was elegant. It was also, Caleb knew, the vehicle for the scheme he had been tracking for 3 weeks. Meridian Pacific had 7 active projects across Southeast Asia, and 6 of them shared a silent capital partner with one of Diana's private equity vehicles. The proposal had been written to look like a business case. It was actually a transfer mechanism. Eleanor called him into her office that afternoon. She was standing at the window when he came in, which meant she had been thinking about this before he arrived. She said without preface, I need a counter-analysis on Meridian Pacific. Independent, defensible. In 72 hours. She paused. I need it to be airtight. He said nothing for a moment. She said, I know I told you to stand down on the sourcing issue. He said you did. She said, I was wrong. He did not say he knew because there was no point in that. He said, I'll need authorization to pull the internal audit files. She picked up her pen and signed the access form before he finished the sentence. They did not work side by side. That was not how either of them operated. He worked in his office with 3 monitors and a stack of printed filings. She worked in hers with her legal pad and a direct line to outside counsel, and they traded documents through encrypted channels every few hours. What Caleb was building was not an argument. It was a record, the kind that left no interpretive room. On the second night, a little before 10 o'clock, Eleanor passed through the small kitchen at the end of the floor. Caleb was already there, standing at the counter, reading from a printed page. Neither of them said anything for a moment, the way people do when they are both surprised and too tired to construct an approach. Eleanor filled her glass. Then she asked, without quite looking at him, "Do you always stay this late?" He said, "Not always. This one matters." She said, "Most of them matter." He said, "This one is different." She looked over at him then. He was looking at the page in his hand. She understood that he meant the stakes. She also understood, in the quiet of that particular moment, that she had been in this building for 6 weeks, and this was the first conversation she had had with anyone that felt like 2 people speaking to each other rather than 2 positions managing contact. She said quietly, "Thank you." He looked up. She was already turning to go. He watched the door close behind her and stood for a moment in the empty kitchen, and then he set the page down, straightened it, and went back to work. The counter-analysis was delivered at 6:48 on the morning of the 72nd hour. 112 pages, structured across 7 sections, with an appendix of supporting filings. It documented the corporate network linking Meridian Pacific Holdings to Diana Ashworth's private investments with a clarity that required no legal interpretation. The relationship was direct, material, and undisclosed to the board. The financial modeling showed that under Meridian Pacific's proposed terms, Harmon Group would absorb an effective capital transfer of between $40 and $60 million over the first 3 years, with exposure increasing if the expansion met its growth targets. It was not the outline of a problem. It was the problem, in full. Eleanor read it in her office with the door closed. She called Caleb in at 8:15. He sat across from her and waited. She said, "You had this." He said, "I had the shape of it. I needed the access to build the structure." She looked at the page in front of her. "I could have given you the access 4 weeks ago." He did not answer that. She looked up. "I hear you not saying it," she said. He said, "There's no point in saying it now." She nodded. Jessica, watching through the glass panel of the outer office, noted that it was the first time she had ever seen Eleanor Harmon look genuinely reckoned with, rather than simply measured, by someone, and made a mental note to say nothing about it whatsoever. In the days that followed, the quality of the space between them changed. Not in any way that announced itself. Not in any way that produced a comment or a conversation, just in the small structural ways that shift without permission. Caleb began to see, through the pattern of her decisions, the architecture of a person who had decided very early that being needed was safer than being known, and who had built an entire professional identity on making herself indispensable before anyone could ask her to be vulnerable. He recognized it the way you recognize a structure you have also lived inside. Eleanor, for her part, began to hear things differently. One afternoon she stopped him in the hallway, brief, almost casual, and asked, "Do you ever complain about anything?" He considered the question seriously. He said, "Complaining doesn't change the output." She said, "That's not what I asked." He looked at her for a moment, then he said, "No, not really," and he walked on. She stood in the hallway for 3 seconds longer than necessary, and then she walked back to her office and picked up the next file. Diana Ashworth called for a board vote on the Meridian Pacific proposal. The date was set, and Eleanor, who had spent her entire professional life walking into rooms prepared to win, found that the thing she was most aware of going in was not the argument which she had, but the person sitting in the row behind her who had handed her the argument when she needed it most, and had not once asked her to acknowledge that he had. The board meeting was held on a Thursday at 2 in the afternoon, in the large conference room on the 31st floor with the glass wall that looked out over the lake. 12 people around the table. Diana Ashworth sat at the far end, composed with her materials arranged in front of her. Eleanor sat at the head. Caleb was in the row of chairs along the side wall. Not a voting member, not a named participant, but present for the same reason a surgeon has an instrument tray. Because preparation is not performance, it is function. Eleanor presented the counter-analysis without flourish. She laid out the corporate network, the financial modeling, the disclosed relationships, and the ones that had not been disclosed, and she did it in the exact register that Caleb had come to recognize as her version of precision: no excess, no repetition, every word selected for what it carried. The room was very quiet. 3 of the board members had received advance summaries from Diana's office, Eleanor had anticipated that and addressed their likely objections in sequence before they were raised. Diana said nothing during the presentation. She sat with her hands folded and waited. When Eleanor finished, Diana asked to respond. She acknowledged the analysis calmly, agreed that the data was thorough, and then said that before the vote was taken, she wanted to raise a concern about the integrity of the process that had produced it. She placed a folder on the table and slid it to the center. Inside were photographs, time-stamped, taken from building security cameras, showing Caleb and Eleanor in the office building on multiple evenings, late hours, closed rooms. The photos showed nothing incriminating, because nothing incriminating had occurred. But the suggestion was embedded in the presentation, that the analysis had been produced under conditions that raised a question about professional distance, and that the board deserved to know that before relying on it as the basis of a $100 million decision. The room shifted. Caleb felt the shift from the wall. He did not move. Eleanor stood at the head of the table with 12 pairs of eyes on her. She was aware of Jessica at the far end of the observer section and of Caleb along the side wall, and of the particular quality of silence that a room produces when people are deciding which way the weight is going to fall. She knew what the correct response was. She had known it before Diana finished her sentence. Every exchange between myself and Mr. Monroe has been conducted within the scope of professional responsibilities and is fully documented in the company's communication archive, she said. Her voice was level. I have nothing to present in my defense because there is nothing that requires defense, she paused. Then she turned, not sharply, not with ceremony, and said directly to Caleb in the voice of a CEO addressing a technical resource. Mr. Monroe, thank you for your contributions to this analysis. Going forward, all technical review for this project will be handled through the Independent Audit Division. Then she turned back to the board. It was the correct move. From a governance standpoint, from a liability standpoint, from a strategy standpoint, it was exactly right. It drew a clear line between her and the association Diana was trying to build. It answered the insinuation without dignifying it. It was, by every measure she had been trained to apply, correct. Caleb heard it. He understood it for what it was. He also understood what it cost her to say it and what it cost him to hear it. Not because it was cruel. She had not been cruel. But because she had said in the clearest possible terms, in a room full of people, that when the moment required a choice, the choice was separation. He sat in his chair along the wall and did not change his expression. When the meeting ended and the board voted 7-3 to reject the Meridian Pacific proposal, he stood, collected his materials, and walked out with Ryan. Ryan said nothing until they reached the elevator. Then, she had to do that. Caleb pressed the button. I know, he said. The elevator arrived. They got in. Caleb looked at the numbers above the door as they descended and thought about the way the room had felt in the 1 second before Eleanor spoke. When she had looked at him, not long enough for anyone watching to name it, but long enough for him to see the exact shape of what she was about to do before she did it. Then the doors opened and he went back to his office and finished the work he had left on his desk, because the work was still there and it still needed to be done. The email arrived in Eleanor's inbox at 7:43 the following morning. Subject line, Notice of Resignation, Caleb Monroe. 2 paragraphs. The first thanked the company for the opportunity and outlined the transition period. 2 weeks, during which he would document all active projects and prepare briefing materials for his successor. The second stated his last working day and expressed confidence in the team's ability to continue. There was no third paragraph. There was no sentence that said anything other than what it needed to say. Eleanor read it twice. She called his desk line. It rang through to voicemail. She called his cell. The call connected and then ended, not sent to voicemail. Ended meant he had seen her name and made a decision. She set her phone down on the desk and sat very still. Then she went down to his floor. His office was already partially cleared. The engineering drawings that had covered the left wall were down. The monitors had been repositioned for whoever came next. The bookshelves had been straightened in the way a person straightens things when they are preparing to hand a space back. He was not there. Jessica appeared in the doorway behind her and said quietly, "He came in around 5. He didn't stop to talk to anyone." Eleanor stood in the middle of the empty office for a moment, then she said, "Get me the transition plan when it's ready." She walked out. Ryan came to her office that afternoon without an appointment. He knocked, came in, and sat down in the chair across from her desk without being invited, which was not something he would normally do. He said, "I'm not here to argue with you." She said, "Good." He said, "I just want to say one thing." She put her pen down. He said, "Caleb Monroe has never once done anything in that building for any reason except that it was right. He's never played an angle. He's never taken credit for anyone else's work. He's never asked for anything back. In 6 years I've watched him do this job for the company and never for himself. He paused. That's the only thing I wanted to say. He stood up and left. The consequences were not catastrophic and not immediate, which, in a certain way, made them worse, because there was no single crisis to point to. A procurement timeline slipped 2 weeks when a junior manager misread a contingency structure that Caleb had always managed through knowledge he had never written down, because he had never expected not to be there. A report that should have taken 4 days took 9. Small things. The kind that accumulate into a portrait. Joseph called on a Tuesday evening and said, very simply, I heard Caleb resigned. Eleanor said, yes. Joseph said, Eleanor, just the name. Then what did you do? She said, I made the right call. Joseph was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I taught you to make the right call in a boardroom. I don't think I taught you enough about what you give up when you only know how to make the right call. She did not respond. He said, call him. She said good night. She hung up. She sat at the kitchen table of her apartment and held her phone in both hands and did not make the call. Caleb, 3 weeks after his last day, incorporated a small independent advisory firm. He took 2 clients in the first month, mid-sized development companies that had heard his name through industry channels where names travel when someone is genuinely good. He worked out of a small office in the West Loop. He did not tell anyone at Harmon Group the address. 3 months after Caleb Monroe's last day at Harmon Group, Eleanor Harmon got out of a taxi on a side street in the West Loop on a Tuesday afternoon and stood for a moment on the sidewalk looking at the building in front of her. She had found the address herself, not through a corporate search, not through anyone at the company, but by calling a woman at a trade association who had given it to her after a moment of professional pause. Eleanor had put the address in her phone and done nothing with it for 3 weeks. Today she had closed her laptop at noon, taken her coat from the hook, and told Jessica she would be out for the afternoon. Jessica had not asked where she was going. The office was on the 3rd floor, small, clean, organized in the way that Caleb organized all spaces, efficient without being spare, everything in its correct position. He was at his desk when she came in, reading from a printed document, and he looked up without surprise, not the performed calm of someone who had expected her but decided in advance not to show it. The actual absence of surprise, as if the situation were simply arriving on its natural schedule. Eleanor remained standing just inside the door. I didn't come to ask you to come back, she said. Because that was the thing she needed to say first, to establish that she had not come to manage him or make an offer she could control. Caleb said, I know. She said, I came to apologize. He said nothing. He set the document down and waited. She said it plainly because she had no other register. I used the work you gave me, and then I put distance between us when it became a liability to be associated with you. Not because what you did was wrong, because I needed the board to see that I wasn't compromised. She paused. You weren't a compromise, but I let the room see you as one. Caleb looked at her. She said I was wrong. He said, yes. Not unkind, just accurate. Then he said, I know why you did it. She said, don't. He said, I'm not excusing it. I'm saying I understood it in the moment it was happening. You were scared. And when you're scared, you do the one thing you've always done. You take control of the surface so the inside doesn't show. She did not argue because it was true. That's still not acceptable, she said. He said, no, it isn't. The agreement sat between them without agenda. She asked quietly, were you angry? He said, no. She asked, why not? He thought for a moment, then he said, because I'd already seen who you were before that moment, and I'd already decided what I thought of her. She said, that's a generous way to look at it. He said, it's an accurate way to look at it. Generous would be pretending it didn't happen. She moved to the window, the one that looked out over the street below, and stood with her back partially to him. She said, my father told me you were someone who needed to be seen. Not your work, you. She paused. I think I saw you. I just didn't do anything with it. She turned back. I think that's actually worse than not seeing you at all. Caleb stood. He walked to the other side of the desk and leaned against it. Not in defense, but in the posture of a person settling in to say something that required steadiness. He said, the day of the board meeting, when you looked at me before answering Diana's technical question. 1 second. Maybe less. She nodded. That was the first time in 6 months in that building that I felt like someone was looking at me and not at what I could produce. And then 5 minutes later you drew a line between us in front of 12 people. He said it without bitterness. Just with the clarity of a fact being placed on a table where it belonged. I didn't leave because I was angry. I left because I realized I'd been staying for the wrong reason, because I kept thinking the person I'd seen in that 1 second was going to have enough room to show up again. I needed to stop waiting for that. Eleanor stood very still. He said, you asked if I forgave you. I do. I did, probably before I even handed in the notice. She said, then why? He said, because forgiveness and proximity aren't the same thing. I needed to build something of my own, in a place where what I contribute doesn't get used as evidence. She looked at him for a long time, then she said, I understand. She picked up her coat. Thank you for seeing me. He said, take care of yourself, Eleanor. She walked to the door. She did not stop. She did not look back. She went down the stairs and out into the street and stood on the sidewalk in the October cold. And did not cry because she had not cried in years, and she was not going to start because of a conversation she had needed to have. But she stood there for a moment longer than she needed to, just standing. The months that followed moved the way months move when the most dramatic thing has already happened, and what remains is the slower, less visible work of living with it. Eleanor went back to Harmon Group and called a meeting of the senior team. She told them, without explanation or performance, that the Meridian Pacific Review had exposed structural gaps in how the company managed technical oversight, and that she was implementing a new cross-departmental accountability structure. She also initiated a formal governance investigation into Diana Ashworth's undisclosed investment relationships, which resulted in Diana's resignation from the board 6 weeks later. The investigation was clean, documented, and conducted without announcement. She did not need to announce it. Joseph heard about Diana through the board chair. He called Eleanor that same evening. He said, you finally did it. She said, I should have done it sooner. He said, yes. Then, after a pause, did you talk to Caleb? She said, yes. He said, how did it go? She said, the way it needed to. He did not ask more than that. She said, you were right, by the way, about what you said, that I don't know how to trust people before it's too late. Joseph was quiet for a moment. Then he said, you trusted him with the work. That's where you start, Eleanor. Not everyone learns that. She said goodnight and meant it more warmly than she usually did. The expansion into Southeast Asia moved forward on a timeline the operations team had built from the audit records Caleb had assembled, records that formed the backbone of the new partnership agreements without anyone saying his name aloud in the room. It was the kind of contribution that does not appear in the official history of how things get built, but that holds the structure up nonetheless. 6 months after their conversation in the West Loop office, Eleanor received an email at 11:43 in the evening. There was no subject line, there was no greeting, there was no closing. There was only a link to an article published in an industry management journal, authored by Caleb Monroe, on the subject of risk assessment frameworks in large-scale cross-border development projects. She opened it and read the way she read everything, quickly at first, then again more slowly. Near the end, in the section on decision-making under institutional pressure, there was a paragraph that said, the determining factor in any high-stakes process is not the quality of the data available, but whether the people responsible for interpreting that data have been given, or have chosen to give themselves, the freedom to say what they actually see. She read that paragraph 3 times. She did not reply to the email. She did not close the article either. She saved it to a folder that only she had access to, closed her laptop, and sat for a while in the quiet of her apartment. The city outside was dark and ordinary and going about its own business. Inside, Eleanor Harmon sat without her phone and without her legal pad and without anything she needed to decide, and let the silence be what it was.